Don't interrupt. You're not part of this conversation. The words weren't shouted, but they cut through the room sharper than any raised voice ever could, slipping between the soft clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of jazz like something cold and deliberate. And Naomi Brooks felt them without even being directly addressed, because that was the point, wasn't it? Not to speak to her, not to see her, not to acknowledge that she was standing right there with a tray balanced perfectly in her hands, posture straight, expression calm, invisible in plain sight inside one of Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurants, where every table whispered power and every guest wore confidence like a tailored suit. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire CEO whose name alone could move markets, whose presence filled the room without effort, whose eyes had scanned billion-dollar deals but never once dropped low enough to meet hers, not when she poured his water, not when she adjusted the placement of his silverware, not even when her shadow briefly crossed the polished mahogany table as she stepped closer to refill his glass, because to him she wasn't a person, she was part of the background, like the music, like the lighting, like the city skyline stretching endlessly behind glass walls glowing amber against the night. And Naomi had learned long ago how to exist in that space, where people spoke around you instead of to you, where fingers snapped instead of names being called, where thank you was replaced by silence and expectation. But tonight something felt different, something tighter, like the air itself was holding its breath, because this wasn't just dinner, this was a deal, a massive one, the kind that would be written about in headlines by morning, a merger worth hundreds of millions sitting neatly inside a slim black folder just inches from Ethan's hand, and everyone at the table knew it. You could see it in the way they leaned forward, the way their voices dropped just slightly, the way anticipation buzzed beneath every word. And Naomi noticed everything, the small misalignments, the numbers mentioned too quickly, the subtle tension in the opposing executive's jaw, details most people would miss because they weren't looking, but she was always looking, always listening, because when the world refuses to see you, you learn to see everything else. And as she stepped back into the rhythm of service, moving quietly between tables, her eyes flickered once more toward that folder, toward a single page that had been turned just enough for her to catch a glimpse. A number that didn't match, a figure slightly off, small enough to be overlooked, big enough to matter. But before the thought could fully form, Ethan's voice cut through again, calm, controlled, dismissive. "Let's proceed," he said. Not to her, never to her. And just like that the room leaned in closer, the moment tightening like a wire stretched to its limit, seconds ticking down towards something none of them could yet see. Not the investors, not the executives, and certainly not the man who believed he controlled everything. Because the one person who noticed the flaw, the one person who could have stopped what was coming, was the one person he chose to ignore. The pen hovered just above the paper, and for a brief second everything felt suspended, like the city itself had paused to watch a signature that would shift millions of dollars with a single stroke. And Naomi saw it again, that number, slightly misaligned in a column of otherwise perfect figures, a detail so small it could hide in plain sight. But her chest tightened because she knew numbers did not lie, people did. And this one was wrong. She stepped forward instinctively, her grip tightening slightly around the edge of the tray as her voice rose just enough to exist. "Sir, excuse me." But the words barely traveled 2 feet before they were cut down by silence. Not loud, not aggressive, just absence, the kind of silence that says you were never meant to speak in the first place. Ethan did not look up, did not pause, did not even blink, his attention fixed entirely on the man across from him who was already smiling. Already anticipating the close, already tasting the victory before it was real. And Naomi felt that familiar wall slam back into place, the invisible barrier that separated people like her from moments like this. But something in her did not settle this time, something pushed, a quiet urgency that refused to be ignored. She shifted her weight, took a half step closer. "Sir, I think there is. We are in the middle of something." One of the executives interrupted without even turning his head, his tone polished but firm, like correcting a minor inconvenience, and a few subtle glances flickered around the table, not at her, never at her, but through her, past her, as if she had briefly disrupted the aesthetic of the evening. Naomi stopped, the words still forming but now trapped behind expectation, behind rules she had learned never to break. Do not interrupt, do not correct, do not become visible. And yet the number stayed in her mind, repeating louder now, like a ticking clock counting down towards something no one else could hear. Ethan's hand lowered slightly, pen touching paper, the first stroke beginning, and across the table the opposing executive leaned back just enough, a flicker of something sharp passing through his eyes, something Naomi caught instantly because she was watching what others were not, Not the deal, not the power, but the people behind it, and in that moment she understood, not fully, not with all the details, but enough to feel the shift, enough to know this was not just a mistake, it was a trap dressed as opportunity. Her breath caught. "Wait," she said, louder this time, the word slipping out before she could stop it, and for the first time the pen paused, not because he heard her, but because the man across the table suddenly leaned forward, his smile tightening. "Actually," he said smoothly, tapping the page with a manicured finger, "there is something we should clarify first." And just like that, the room tilted. The energy shifting from confidence to calculation in a single heartbeat, chairs adjusted, eyes narrowed, the rhythm broken. Ethan's gaze finally dropped, not to Naomi, not yet, but to the document, to the exact line she had been staring at, and the silence that followed was no longer dismissive, it was heavy, charged, the kind that builds before something cracks. Naomi stood frozen at the edge of it all, unseen but no longer unaware, as the first thread of control slipped from the hands of the man who believed he held everything together, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of that perfect night, chaos had already begun. The shift was almost invisible, but everyone felt it. The kind of change that does not announce itself but settles into the room like a sudden drop in temperature. And Ethan's pen lifted slowly from the page, hovering. Now instead of moving, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he followed the opposing executive's finger to the exact line Naomi had been watching. The number sitting there quietly, confidently, as if it belonged, as if it had always been correct, and for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because something no one had expected was beginning to surface. "Can you walk me through this figure again?" Ethan said finally, his voice still calm but no longer casual, no longer certain, and the man across from him smiled again, but this time it was thinner, more controlled. "Of course," he replied, leaning forward, adjusting his cuff as if this were routine, as if nothing had changed, but Naomi saw the difference, the micro-hesitation, the fraction of a second too long before the explanation began, and she knew that pause mattered. That number reflects projected distribution costs over the next 18 months. The man continued, smooth, practiced, confident. But Ethan did not nod this time, did not accept it at face value. Instead his gaze stayed fixed, calculating, and around the table the others began to shift, subtle movements, a cleared throat, a glass set down more carefully than before, the rhythm of certainty breaking apart piece by piece. Naomi stood still, her heart steady but alert, because she had seen this before in smaller ways, not in boardrooms or billion-dollar deals, but in everyday moments where something did not add up and no one wanted to be the one to question it, except this time the stakes were louder, heavier, measured not in inconvenience but in millions. And then Ethan did something he had not done all night. He read, not skimmed, not assumed, but actually read the document in front of him, line by line, number by number, his finger tracing the column slowly as if the truth might be hiding between the digits. And that was when it happened, not an explosion, not a shout, just a single word spoken quieter than anything that had come before. "No," he said, almost to himself, but it landed like a crack through glass because now everyone leaned in, now everyone was listening. "This does not align with the earlier projections," he added, louder now, his voice sharpening as the pieces began to connect, and the man across from him straightened slightly, the confidence in his posture tightening. "There must be a misunderstanding," he replied, but the room no longer accepted easy answers, not now, not after the pause, not after the shift, and Naomi saw it unfold exactly the way tension always does when it finally reaches the surface. The quick exchange of glances, the silent calculations, the realization spreading from one face to another that something was off, something real, something costly. And for the first time since the night began, Ethan looked up, not past her, not through her, but directly at Naomi, just for a second, just long enough for recognition to flicker, not of who she was, but of what had just happened, that she had tried to speak, that she had seen something before anyone else did. And in that brief moment the balance of the room shifted again, because the person he had ignored was now standing at the edge of the truth. He was only beginning to understand. And the silence that followed was no longer about control, it was about consequence, quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The room did not erupt, it tightened like a system recalibrating under pressure, and Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the document still open in front of him, but now it was no longer just paper, it was evidence, and his eyes moved faster, sharper, scanning each line with a precision that had built his empire. while across from him the opposing executive adjusted his posture again, this time more deliberately, as if trying to regain control of something that had already begun slipping. "Let us not overcomplicate this," the man said, his tone measured but firmer now. "These projections have been reviewed multiple times." But Ethan did not respond immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any argument, because it meant he was thinking, recalculating, and most importantly, doubting. And doubt in a room like this spreads faster than certainty ever could. One investor leaned closer, another reached for the document, a third pulled out his phone discreetly under the table, not to distract but to verify, to check, to confirm, because no one wanted to be the last to realize something was wrong. And Naomi watched it all unfold from just a few feet away, her tray now resting lightly against her hip, forgotten for the first time that night, because this was no longer about service, this was about consequence, and she could feel it building layer by layer, the quiet unraveling of a deal that had seemed untouchable just moments ago. Ethan's finger stopped again on the same number, and this time he tapped it once, slow, deliberate. "This is inflated," he said, not asking, not suggesting, stating, and the word landed heavily, cutting through whatever control remained. The opposing executive's smile faded just slightly, replaced by something tighter, something defensive. "That is a strong claim," he replied, but his voice no longer carried the same ease, and everyone heard it, everyone felt it, the shift from confidence to containment. And then Ethan did something no one expected. He closed the folder, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to signal a pause, a break in momentum, and that single motion changed everything, because deals like this do not pause unless something is wrong. "We are not signing tonight," he said. Calm but final, and the reaction was immediate, not loud but undeniable. Chairs shifted, breaths caught, eyes widened just enough to reveal what words did not, and Naomi saw the exact moment the room understood. Not just that something was off, but that something had almost gone very wrong, and in that realization all attention subtly redirected, not openly, not obviously, but enough for Ethan's gaze to return to her once more. Longer this time, more focused, as if he was finally seeing what had been there all along, and for a brief second, the roles in the room adjusted, the man who controlled everything now standing on uncertain ground, and the woman who had been invisible now standing at the edge of the truth that had just stopped it all. And no one said it out loud, but everyone felt it, the quiet, undeniable fact that the chaos they had just avoided had been seen first by the one person no one had bothered to listen to. No one reached for their glass anymore, no one checked their phone, no one pretended this was just another negotiation, because the illusion had already cracked and everyone in the room knew it, even if no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. And Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the closed folder as if feeling the weight of what almost happened, not just the money, not just the deal, but the control he nearly lost without even realizing it. And then slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward Naomi, not past her, not through her, but directly at her. And this time there was no dismissal in his eyes, no indifference, only a quiet, searching focus, the kind reserved for problems that matter. "You," he said, not sharply, not rudely, but with a clarity that shifted the air again. And for the first time that night, the room followed his gaze, really followed it, landing on Naomi as if she had just appeared out of nowhere, as if she had not been there the entire time, moving silently between them, observing everything they had missed. And Naomi felt it instantly, the weight of attention, unfamiliar, heavy, but she did not step back, did not lower her eyes, she simply stood there, steady, composed, the same way she had carried herself all night, except now the room was finally looking. "What did you see?" Ethan asked. And it was not a challenge, not an accusation, it was a question, direct and unfiltered. And that alone was enough to shift something deeper than the deal itself, because it meant he was willing to listen, even if only now, even if only because something had gone wrong. And Naomi took a breath, not to prepare, but to center, because she had already seen it, already understood it, long before anyone else had even thought to question. "The distribution cost projection," she said calmly, her voice even measured. "It is higher than the previous figures mentioned earlier in the conversation, by almost 12%. And the precision of her words landed differently than expected, not hesitant, not unsure, but clear, specific, grounded in observation. And a ripple moved through the table, subtle but undeniable, because now it was no longer just suspicion, it was confirmation from someone who had nothing to gain by speaking, and everything to lose by being wrong. Ethan's eyes did not leave her as she continued, and the timeline attached to it does not match the 18-month structure he just described. she added, nodding slightly toward the opposing executive, not confrontational, just factual, and for a moment no one spoke because the simplicity of what she said cut through all the complexity they had been hiding behind, and the man across the table shifted again, this time unable to mask it completely. That is an interpretation, he replied quickly, but the confidence was thinner now, stretched, fragile, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable but focused, processing not just the information, but the source, the fact that the person who caught what his entire team missed was someone he had not even acknowledged until seconds ago, and that realization carried its own weight, heavier than the numbers. Heavier than the deal because it forced a different kind of question, not about the contract but about himself, about what else he had overlooked simply because he never thought to look, and around them the room held its breath again, not in anticipation of a deal, but in recognition of something far more uncomfortable, the quiet shift of power that no one had planned for, and in that moment, Naomi was no longer invisible, not because she demanded to be seen, but because the truth she spoke made it impossible for anyone to look away. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment, even the skyline beyond the glass seemed still, as if the entire city had paused to hear what would come next, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He did not rush to defend, did not dismiss, he simply looked at Naomi, really looked this time, studying not just her words but her certainty, the way she stood without hesitation, without apology, and that alone told him more than any report ever could, because confidence like that does not come from guessing, it comes from knowing. And slowly, he turned back to the document, reopening the folder with a measured motion, his fingers tracing the same line once more, but now with a different lens, not assumption, not authority but verification, and one of his advisors leaned in closer, whispering something under his breath, numbers, recalculations, confirmations, and the tension sharpened again, not chaotic, but precise, like a system being corrected in real time. And across the table the opposing executive adjusted his tie, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning now than before because control was no longer his to hold alone. If there is concern we can revisit the structure, he said, attempting to steady the situation, but his voice lacked the ease it once carried, and Ethan did not look up this time when he answered. We are revisiting it, he said quietly, his tone even, but firm enough to close any argument before it could begin, and that was when the shift became undeniable, because the conversation no longer revolved around persuasion, it revolved around truth, and truth does not bend to confidence, it exposes it, and Naomi remained where she stood, no longer moving, no longer serving, just present, her role in the room rewritten without announcement, without permission, simply by being right. And one of the investors spoke up, hesitant at first, then more certain, asking for the original projections, asking for the breakdown, asking the questions that should have been asked earlier, and each question layered onto the next, building pressure, revealing gaps, inconsistencies, and the polished narrative that had been presented minutes ago began to unravel, thread by thread, and Ethan listened to it all, but his attention returned once more to Naomi, not out of curiosity now but recognition, because in a room full of power, full of experience, full of people who had built their reputations on seeing what others missed, she had seen first, and that fact could not be ignored, not anymore. How did you catch it? He asked, and the question carried something new, not authority, not dominance but respect, quiet and unspoken, and Naomi did not hesitate. I was listening, she said simply, and the answer was almost too small for the weight it carried, because it exposed something deeper than a mistake in a contract. It exposed a flaw in the room itself, a room so focused on speaking, on leading, on controlling, that no one had taken the time to truly listen, and that realization settled over them all, heavier than any number on the page, because it meant the chaos they had just avoided was not random, it was preventable, and the only reason it had been prevented was because someone they chose to ignore had been paying attention the entire time. No one rushed to fill the silence this time, because silence had already proven more powerful than words in that room, and Ethan leaned forward again, slower now, more deliberate, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as if grounding himself in a moment that had quietly shifted beyond his control, and for the first time that night, he was no longer leading the pace, he was following it, recalibrating, adjusting, and the difference was subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift only those paying close attention could feel, and Naomi noticed it instantly, because she had been watching from the beginning, watching how confidence moved, how authority spoke, and now how it hesitated, how it listened, and around them the conversation resumed, but it was no longer smooth, no longer rehearsed, it was fragmented, cautious, every statement now followed by verification, every number questioned, every assumption challenged, and the opposing executive, once composed and controlled, now found himself responding instead of directing, explaining instead of persuading, and each explanation carried less certainty than the one before, until even his own words began to sound like placeholders rather than facts. And Ethan let it happen. He did not interrupt, did not rescue the conversation, he simply observed, allowing the truth to surface on its own terms, and that decision spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it meant he was no longer interested in closing the deal, he was interested in understanding it, and those are two very different things, and Naomi remained still, but inside, something shifted, not pride, not validation, something quieter, something steadier, the realization that she had not needed permission to be right, only the courage to hold on to what she saw, even when no one else was willing to see it with her. And then, without raising his voice, without drawing attention, Ethan made the moment official. "We will be conducting a full review before moving forward," he said, his tone calm but final, leaving no space for negotiation, and the impact was immediate, not loud but absolute, the kind of decision that redraws the boundaries of a room in an instant. And the opposing executive nodded, but it was not agreement, it was acceptance, the quiet acknowledgement that whatever leverage he had walked in with was no longer his to hold. And as the tension slowly began to release, not disappear, but settle into something more controlled, more honest, Ethan's gaze returned once more to Naomi, and this time there was no question in it, no uncertainty, only recognition, clear and grounded, as if he was finally seeing not just what she had done, but what she represented, and for a brief second the roles reversed completely, the man who had been surrounded by attention now focusing entirely on the one person he had chosen to ignore, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without discomfort, because she was no longer standing in the shadow of the room, she was standing in its center, not by force, not by demand, but by truth, and in that moment something deeper than the deal had changed, something no contract could capture, the understanding that power does not always belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the one who was quiet enough to notice what everyone else missed. The room did not return to normal, because moments like this do not reset, they redefine, and even as conversations resumed in softer tones and chairs shifted back into place, something fundamental had changed, not just in the deal, but in the way everyone now occupied the space, and Ethan remained seated for a second longer than necessary, his gaze lingering not on the document, not on the executives, but on Naomi, as if he was recalculating something far beyond numbers. And then he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the meeting as it had been intended was over. "We will reconvene after a full audit," he said, his voice steady, leaving no ambiguity behind, and one by one the others followed, gathering their things, adjusting their jackets, their movements more controlled now, less certain, because certainty had already proven fragile, and the opposing executive offered a polite nod, but it lacked the sharp confidence he had arrived with, replaced instead by something quieter, something measured, and as the group began to disperse, the energy shifted again, not tense but reflective, like the aftermath of something narrowly avoided, and Naomi turned slightly, instinctively returning to her role, reaching for a glass, adjusting a plate, slipping back into the rhythm she knew, but before she could fully disappear into it, Ethan's voice stopped her, not loud, not commanding, just direct. "Naomi," he said, and the sound of her name landed differently than anything else that night, because it meant he had asked for it, learned it, chosen to use it, and that alone carried more weight than any apology could have. She turned, meeting his gaze again, steady as before, and for a moment he did not speak, as if choosing his words with the same precision he had once reserved only for contracts. "You saw something no one else did," he said finally, and there was no arrogance in it, no attempt to reclaim control, just acknowledgement, clear and unfiltered, and Naomi gave a small nod, not proud, not dismissive, just honest. "I was paying attention," she replied, the same words, but now they carried even more meaning, because this time they were heard fully. And Ethan let out a quiet breath. Not relief, not frustration, something in between, something closer to understanding. "That attention just saved me from making a very expensive mistake," he said, and the truth of it settled between them without exaggeration, without need for emphasis, and for the first time that night, there was no distance in the exchange, no invisible line separating power from presence, just two people standing in the same moment, connected by something simple and undeniable, truth recognized too late, but not too late to matter. And as the last of the guests exited and the room slowly returned to its quiet elegance, the lights still warm, the skyline still glowing, Naomi stood there for a second longer, not because she needed recognition, but because something had shifted inside her as well, not in who she was, but in how she had been seen. And Ethan, still watching her, understood something he had not considered before, that power was not just about control or influence or the ability to close a deal. It was also about knowing when to listen and, more importantly, who you had been ignoring all along. And in that realization, the chaos he had avoided became something else entirely, not just a near mistake but a lesson, quiet, precise, and impossible to forget. As the last few people trickled out of the room, the space began to return to its original quiet, but something felt different. Something intangible had shifted in the way the light reflected off the glass, in the hum of the city beyond the windows, in the very air they breathed. Naomi remained standing near the edge of the room, her hands lightly resting at her sides, the moment of recognition between her and Ethan still lingering like a soft aftertaste. She wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, but it didn't matter because for the first time that night she felt seen, not just as a waitress, not just as someone who had been overlooked, but as someone whose presence in this room had changed its course. Ethan, still lingering at the far end of the room, looked out the window for a moment as if gathering his thoughts, his profile sharp against the backdrop of the city. Then, without turning, he spoke, his voice low. "You know, I've built an entire company on the idea of disruption," he said, the words more to himself than to Naomi. "I thought I understood it. I thought I understood the way things work, but you—" He paused, turning toward her now, his eyes steady, the weight of the past moments still present between them. "You disrupted something in me tonight, something I never thought to question," he said, the words simple, but carrying an undertone of something deeper. Naomi didn't respond right away, instead letting the silence settle, feeling the weight of his admission without needing to answer. It wasn't her job to explain, to fix, or to make him understand. She had already done enough by simply being present, by quietly observing, by seeing what others missed. That was enough. "You've taught me more about power than anyone else ever could," Ethan continued, his tone softening, his gaze no longer distant but focused on her, truly focused. "The kind of power that comes from knowing when to listen, when to step back, and when to admit you're wrong." He paused, letting that hang in the air between them. Naomi could see the sincerity in his expression, but more importantly, she could see the shift in the way he saw her. Not as someone who served, but as someone who saw, someone who had the ability to change the narrative. And it felt like a quiet victory, not for her but for the truth. She met his gaze calmly, still standing firm, but not needing to speak. This wasn't about validation anymore. It wasn't about being heard, because she already knew the power of silence, the power of observation, and how it could shake the foundations of even the most established systems. Ethan gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the shift in himself, in the room, in the whole night. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, but grounded in something more meaningful than just gratitude. Naomi nodded back just once, a subtle acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the moment they had just shared, and she turned, walking toward the door, her footsteps steady, unhurried. As she stepped out into the hallway, the lights in the room dimming behind her, she felt a quiet sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing your worth, from knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand still, observe, and wait for the truth to be revealed. And in that moment she didn't need anything else. The world had already seen what it needed to see.